And to those who think we should reject this deal in favour of no deal because we cannot get every assurance we want, I ask, what would a no-deal Brexit do to strengthen the hand of those campaigning for Scottish independence, or indeed those demanding a border poll in Northern Ireland? Surely this is the real threat to our union. Mr. Speaker, with just 74 days until the 29th of March, the consequences of voting against this deal tomorrow are becoming ever clearer. With no deal, we would have no implementation period, no security partnership, no guarantees for UK citizens overseas, and no certainty for businesses and workers like those I met in Stoke this morning. And we would see changes to everyday life in Northern Ireland that would put the future of our union at risk. And if, rather than leaving with no deal, this House blocked Brexit, that would be a subversion of our democracy, saying to the people we were elected to serve that we were unwilling to do what they had instructed. But when the history books are written, people will look at the decision. People will look at the decision of this House tomorrow and ask, did we deliver on the country's vote to leave the European Union? Did we safeguard our economy, our security and our union? Or did we let the British people down? I say we should deliver for the British people and get on with building a brighter future for our country by backing this deal tomorrow, and I commend this statement to the House. Tomorrow, it would give us almost 2 years to complete the next phase of the negotiations. And of course, we will have the option to extend the implementation period if further time were needed for either 1 or 2 years. It is my absolute conviction that we can turn the political declaration into legal text in that time, avoiding the need for the backstop altogether.
Is the belief of Remain, which is within Scotland, is it the same in Edinburgh as it is in your constituency?
Yeah, Edinburgh was very heavily Remain. In fact, the whole of Scotland was. And, you know, we're pretty distraught with what's going on. We see ourselves as European, and we've benefited enormously from membership of the European Union. When you travel around the Highlands, you will see signs all over the place funded by the European Union. Roads, bridges, harbours. They've recognised that I live in a rural place, very fragile economic place. Europe has been fantastic for us. Of course, many people from Europe come to work in our industries, our tourist industry in particular. We're distraught about losing our rights as European citizens. In fact, we're not prepared to do it.
I can't tell you're Scotland from Iceland. In Game of Thrones, the red-haired girl met Jon Snow. Maybe that was in your constituency. I can't remember. What I do know is essentially it's the middle of nowhere, and yet in other parts of England, people in the middle of nowhere said, we're going to leave. That's still, to me, the major shock here, whether Wales or the Midlands. A lot of people said, leave, even distant from London. Can they be changed in their thought?
I think the whole problem for me about where we are is that we now know the consequences of Brexit. I don't think there is. Yeah, we do. I don't think there is such a thing as a good Brexit. There's no such thing as a jobs-first Brexit. It's going to cost jobs. It's already happening. We saw the impact on the financial markets when we decided to leave in 2016. The pound fell, inflation rose, food prices increased. People have become poorer as a consequence already. Look at the announcement from Jaguar Land Rover last week.
With all due respect, the problem is that the doom and gloom that we were told by the people that were trying to campaign for Remain hasn't happened. I'm looking at the polls, and if there was a second referendum, the outcome may not be much different. So should we not just get along behind Brexit and try and figure out a Brexit that would get through Parliament?
No, because I think when you look at what has happened, the UK has fallen to the bottom of the growth league. Investment has stalled, so there is that impact which is there. All the economic analysis, whether it's from the UK government, the Scottish government, just about any economic institute, says that we are going to be poorer than we would be if we stayed in the European Union.
Is there
we need
a danger?
to have that one.
sir, that by trying to remain in the EU, actually you force a no-deal Brexit?
No, because no deal would be catastrophic. No rational person would want that. And the Prime Minister government has the opportunity to rule that out. And that's why what I'm asking Parliament to do tonight is to postpone Article 50. Let's take that fear away. The way that the Prime Minister has characterised this as a choice between her deal or no deal is actually dishonest. We don't need to be doing that. We need to be a bit more grown up about this and say, right, yes, there are other alternatives, whether that's staying in or whether it's staying in the single market or the customs union. These options are there.
Our team today has done a great job of giving you different opinions, the complexities of this Brexit debate. And when I look at the backstop, which is clearly associated with Ireland, and Arlene Foster to join us here in the next hour, I think of almost a kind of backstop for Scotland. And I understand it's not the same, but there can be some real permanent damage in that distance from London as well. Describe the permanency if we have some form of leave.
Yeah, well, I think that's a very good question, and all of us understand the circumstances in Ireland. We fought very hard for the Good Friday Agreement. It's delivered peace, and it's really important the backstop's there. By the way, we could fix the backstop very easily if we stayed in the single market and the customs union. So the UK government has created this problem. But I think the fundamental point is that if we can have a deal that respects the differences in Ireland, we can have a deal that respects that Scotland voted to remain. Now, there's something very important here.
Please.
Because we had a referendum on Scottish independence in 2014, and we were told if we stayed in the UK, our rights as European citizens would be respected. That's changed, and the Scottish government has a mandate from the people of Scotland to have a referendum, if we so choose, on independence for Scotland. One thing is clear, we're not allowed to be ourselves in the passenger seat when Theresa May drives the bus off the cliff. That will not happen, and the people of Scotland have to have that opportunity, if they so choose, of determining that we stay in the European Union, but as an independent nation.
One final question. What do you want from Mr. Corbyn? If we have a response from Labour, what does SNP want?
For goodness sake, man, get off the fence. Your voters, your members don't wish to leave Europe. You actually need to...
But does he want to leave Europe?
He wants to leave Europe, I think that's the point, but he has to show leadership. I'll say to Jeremy this, that if he doesn't recognise the impact of Brexit and the impact on his voters, he will pay a price. He's a very silly man doing what he's doing. He needs to recognise that leadership means that you have to take responsibility.
All right, Bob. Collaborate, and this Brexit is back with the grand new edition. No deal is the latest sensation, because I make a mess of these negotiations. Should we be worried? I don't know, but I'm stockpiling food like there is no tomorrow. The DUP control the new world order. Why can't the EU? There won't be a hard border. Deadly at the negotiating table. Most definitely not. Weak and unstable. The Chequers plan was my last resort. But take reassurance from the blue and gold passport. People should listen to the message that then the no deal is better than a second referendum. Single market access. We can't solve it. Immigration, though, we can finally control it. No deal. Brexit.
Judgment in the matter of the UK withdrawal from the European Union Legal Continuity Scotland Bill.
In March of this year, the Scottish Parliament passed the UK withdrawal from the European Union, open brackets, legal continuity, close brackets, open brackets, Scotland, close brackets, bill. This provides for the continued validity in Scots law of retained European Union law. It did so before the UK Parliament had passed its own European Union, open brackets, withdrawal, close brackets, Act. Under Section 33 of the Scotland Act 1998, the law officers can refer to this court a bill passed by the Scottish Parliament before it receives royal assent, so that this court can rule on whether it would be within the legislative powers granted to the Scottish Parliament by the Scotland Act. In April of this year, the Attorney General and the Advocate General for Scotland referred to us a number of questions about the Scottish Bill. Before the hearing of that reference in this court, the UK Parliament passed the European Union Withdrawal Act, which came into force in June. This makes similar provision to the Scottish Bill, but on a UK-wide basis. So, in addition to the questions originally referred, we have to decide what difference, if any, that makes. The judgment which is handed down today is the judgment of all 7 of the justices who have taken part in this case. We wish to make it clear that it is no part of our function to determine or to influence the political questions which underlie this dispute. Our role is a purely legal one. Would the bill be within the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament if it were to receive royal assent and become an act? This depends upon a close and detailed examination of the Scotland Act, the Scottish Bill, and the UK Act. Section 29 of the Scotland Act limits the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. 3 of those limitations are relevant to this case. First, a provision of an Act of the Scottish Parliament is outside its legislative powers if it relates to one or more of the reserved matters set out in Schedule 5 to the Scotland Act. Those reserved matters include international relations and the Parliament of the United Kingdom. Secondly, a provision of an Act of the Scottish Parliament is outside its legislative powers if it modifies certain legal provisions which are listed in Schedule 4 to the Scotland Act. These include certain provisions of the European Communities Act 1972 and many of the provisions of the Scotland Act itself. The UK Parliament's European Union Withdrawal Act added itself to the list of those enactments which could not be modified. Section 126, subsection 1 of the Scotland Act provides that the term modify includes amend or repeal. This court concludes that a protected law will be modified by a later provision, not only if it's expressly amended or repealed, but also if it is in substance amended, superseded, disapplied, or repealed by a later one. However, a provision does not modify a protected law simply because it makes additional provision in the same field of law. Thirdly, a provision of an Act of the Scottish Parliament is outside its legislative powers if it is incompatible with European Union law. Incidentally, the presiding officer of the Scottish Parliament concluded that the bill would be outside its legislative powers for this reason. The Lord Advocate, advising the Scottish Government, disagreed. The first question the court has to answer is whether the bill as a whole would be outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament because it relates to reserved matters. The court's answer is that it would not. In particular, although international relations are a reserved matter, the bill is not concerned with international relations, including relations with the European Union. It is concerned with purely domestic rules of law designed to regulate the legal consequences in Scotland of the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the European Union. The court does not accept the other arguments which the UK law officers advance in relation to this question. The bill is not contrary to the constitutional framework underpinning the devolution settlement, if it is not contrary to the Scotland Act, which provides that framework in relation to Scotland. Neither is the bill contrary to the rule of law, as there is nothing contrary to the rule of law in having legislation governing the domestic legal consequences of withdrawal from the European Union at both the United Kingdom and the Scottish levels, provided that they do not conflict in a manner which is not permitted by the Scotland Act. The second question the court has to answer is whether Section 17 of the bill is outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. Section 17 provides that regulations and other subordinate legislation made by United Kingdom ministers under powers conferred by acts of the United Kingdom Parliament, to the extent that they relate to devolved matters, shall have no legal effect unless the consent of the Scottish ministers has first been obtained. The UK law officers make 2 arguments. First, they argue that Section 17 modifies Section 28, subsection 7 of the Scotland Act, which provides that the power of the Scottish Parliament to make laws quote, does not affect the power of the Parliament of the United Kingdom to make laws for Scotland, end quote. Section 28, subsection 7 is one of the provisions protected against modification by Schedule 4. The Court accepts this argument and holds that Section 17 would modify Section 28, subsection 7 of the Scotland Act, since it would render the effect of laws made by the United Kingdom Parliament, conferring powers on United Kingdom ministers in relation to Scotland, conditional on the consent of the Scottish ministers. Secondly, the law officers argue that Section 17 relates to the reserved matter of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, but the Court rejects that argument. The third question is whether Section 33 and Schedule 1 of the Bill, which repeal references to European Union law in Sections 29 and 57 of the Scotland Act, governing the powers of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government respectively, would be outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. The UK law officers make two arguments. First, they argue that the Scottish Parliament cannot legislate so as to determine its own competence. Secondly, they argue that the Scottish Parliament cannot rely on the power given to it by the Scotland Act to repeal spent provisions in that Act, because the provisions referring to EU law will not be spent until the European Communities Act 1972 has been repealed, something which has not yet happened. The Court does not accept either of those arguments. First, the Scottish Parliament is not determining its own competence if it exercises a power given to it by the Scotland Act to repeal spent provisions. Secondly, the provisions would be spent when Section 33 comes into force, since the Bill provides that the Scottish ministers can make regulations to bring Section 33 into force only after the United Kingdom has withdrawn from the European Union. The fourth question is whether the various provisions of the Bill would be outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament because they would be incompatible with European Union law, or because they would modify Section 2, subsection 1 of the European Communities Act 1972, a protected enactment, or would be contrary to the rule of law. The Court does not accept the arguments of the UK law officers on these matters, essentially because Section 1, subsection 2 of the Bill would postpone the coming into effect of any provision in the Bill which would be incompatible with EU law until the relevant EU provision had ceased to have effect in Scotland as a consequence of United Kingdom withdrawal. It follows that of the various challenges to the Bill, in the initial reference, only the challenge to Section 17 succeeds. However, the European Union Withdrawal Act changes the legal landscape. The bill has to be judged not as at the date when it was passed, but as at the date when it would receive royal assent. The UK Act is protected against modification, which prevents the Scottish Bill from amending, superseding, disapplying or repealing provisions of that Act. At the Court's invitation, Council prepared a schedule in which they set out their respective contentions on which provisions of the Scotland Bill would modify provisions of the UK Act. That resulted in a measure of agreement, although there remained matters in dispute. For the detailed reasons set out in the judgment, which I do not propose to summarise in this presentation, the following provisions of the bill would, at least in part, be outside the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. These are Sections 2, subsection 2, 5, 7, subsection 2b and subsection 3, Section 8, subsection 2, Section 9a, Section 9b, subsections 2, 3a and 4a of Section 10, Sections 11, 13b, 14, 14a, 15, 16, 19, subsection 1, 22, 26a, subsection 6, and 33, and Schedule 1, paragraphs 11a and 16. Therefore, apart from those provisions and Section 17, This court holds that the Scottish Bill is within the legislative powers of the Scottish Parliament. The court will now adjourn.
Well, I grew up in a Scotland where the decisions about our future are taken by the people who care most about Scotland, the people who live here.
Why don't you love me anymore?